This happened last night, about midnight. I was in my bed trying to get to sleep when I suddenly heard a frantic knocking on my door. I walked out of my bedroom while the knocking continued on. I heard a woman whispering through my door, "Please, help me," along with crying. It was very faint though, almost inaudible. I looked out the peephole, only to see no one was there. No other doors were being knocked on either, only mine. This was already quite odd by itself, but I was on the 3rd floor of my complex. Why would someone walk all the way up to just my apartment if they were in such distress? Immediately, I took note of something odd sounding about this voice as well. I thought it must be a recording. If someone really needed help, wouldn't they be banging on everyone's door? I called the police immediately, and the dispatcher told me not to open the door no matter what. He asked if I had a weapon as well. I'd heard of this tactic before, albeit with a slightly different variation, that being a recording of a baby crying outside. It's just insane when thinking about the statistics. Stranger abductions usually result in murder. Just so sick to try and prey on people's empathy. Police drove by and I saw them using their spotlight to look throughout the entire complex. As of now though, no one was found out there. If by chance someone really was hurt, I hope they did find her. I've barely slept with all the possibilities of how this person found me, where they saw me, and when they followed me. Did they live in the same complex maybe? I'm 4'10" and live alone, and don't know many people in my area. No close family either. Had someone been watching me and known all this or something? It's just making me go crazy. Stay vigilant and don't fall for these sorts of tactics. This happened about a year ago. If I hadn't already heard of that baby recording thing, I may have actually opened the door. I don't know where I would be right now if I would have. Update. I've talked with the management to let them know what happened. As of right now, not a single other person reported anything similar happening, and nobody else heard that voice either. I'm gonna call the police again for an update too. I was redirected to another PD, but they weren't the ones who initially responded. I know it takes some time for reports to be filed, so I'm trying my best to be patient. I want to know if this has happened to anyone else. As far as it being a prank, I guess it could possibly be. I'd be more inclined to believe that, though, if it had happened to anybody else in the apartment complex. Maybe it had, but they hadn't said anything. This happened when I was in college. I was home for the summer working, and my boyfriend was also home for the summer living with his parents. They were about an hour and a half away. We finally had a rare day when neither of us needed to work, so we drove down to spend the entire day with me. We were saving for the coming school year, so we tried not to spend too much. That ended up meaning we ate lunch and dinner with my family at my house. We didn't get much alone time because of this. After dinner, we wanted to have some time to ourselves as a couple, so we decided to pick up some root beer floats at Sonic and drive out to a local state park where young couples like to hang out. We parked and walked out to one of the little covered picnic tables in the woods. While the parking lot itself was well lit, because of how thick the woods were, it was quite dark sitting at the picnic table. We'd hung out there late into the night before though, and it had always been perfectly safe. For some reason this time though, I felt really nervous sitting in the dark when another couple popped out of the woods just past where we were and started making out leaning up against each other at the other end of the table. We moved to my boyfriend's pickup. My boyfriend turned on the radio for some ambiance, and we sat in companionable silence attempting to eat our ice cream before too much of it melted. Due to the heat, we had the windows rolled down as well. After a while, the couple we'd seen burst out of the woods and left. Looking around, I realized something quite odd. Although there were normally at least half a dozen vehicles parked in this particular lot on any evening, we were the only vehicle in sight tonight. Even so, I didn't really think too much of it and continued to finish up my ice cream. All of a sudden, out of nowhere though, I got the most horrifying feeling. You know that feeling when your hair immediately stands up on the back of your neck? You can feel someone looking at you when you thought you were alone. It was just like that, except so much worse. I had the distinct feeling I needed to run right now in the pit of my stomach. I started looking around the woods frantically and realized my boyfriend was also searching as well. I asked him if he also got a bad feeling. His reply was an emphatic hell yes. He started the truck and began to drive out of the park. Since we were facing into the park, he had to make a U-turn to turn around. As we passed back by the area where we'd been parked, a man stepped out of the edge of the woods. This happened on a Wednesday night. About a week later, someone found bodies in the woods just past where we'd been seated at the picnic table. When the crime was eventually solved, it came out a man was living in a hidden shack on the property. He was working as a maintenance worker for the park during the day and killed a couple on that Saturday night just after we left. The photo of the killer in the newspaper was the photo of the man we'd seen step out of the woods and watch us leave. This experience happened to my roommates and I in our second year of university. The city we went to school in was considered a very safe university town. The most we had heard of happening was some drunk morons doing typical drunk moron things. This was also the first time we were really living on our own. First-year residences are nice, but it's basically an extended summer camp rather than a typical living situation. The four of us girls lived in a nice townhouse that never once had a creepy vibe or weird neighbors or anything like that in the months we lived there. The only eerie part really was that every weekend we were the only people who actually stayed in the complex. All of our neighbors either went home or stayed elsewhere until returning Monday for classes. This was never something we had given a second thought to though, considering this was fairly normal for a university town, especially because our complex was only made up of 4 other townhouses. The complex itself was surrounded by walking trails and farm fields, which we all quite liked actually. It was like a nice quiet spot away from all the chaos of other college kids. There were a few farmhouses we could see from our backyard, but other than that, we were pretty secluded. The university was about a 20-minute bus ride away. That was never a big deal for any of us though, especially because the rent was far cheaper here than other places within walking distance. Being 5'6", I was the tallest by a considerable margin. I was also the only one of the entire group who had been in a handful of scary situations. Due to this, I was the only one who would ever remember to lock the doors, window, and garage before leaving or going to bed. My roommates all grew up in small, very safe towns, so it was very uncommon for them to lock their doors back at home. They were also incredibly kind and trusting to everyone. You know the type, never considering anyone has hidden bad intentions. The night in question started off very normally. We had planned on having a wine and movie night together. This was kind of a weekly tradition for us. We would pick some dumbass movie, get takeout, and get a little bit of a buzz going after a week of long classes and work. At this point, it was early November, so we had been doing this for several months with no issue. By 8:30ish, we had all settled on the couch in our living room and started up a comedy. With it being November, it was already completely dark outside now, other than our porch light you could see from the small window at the very top of our door. None of us were tall enough to actually see anything out of that window anyway, so we relied entirely on our peephole. It took a great deal of effort for me to convince my roommates to ever check the peephole before opening the door. This was a talk I had to have with them after one roommate had opened the door for our neighbor's very drunk friend, who proceeded to vomit all over everything. Not long after ordering some takeout, we heard a banging on our front door. My friend Jess made a joke about how the delivery guy must have taken a helicopter or something to get here this quickly, especially considering the place we ordered from was very close to campus. This was not a typical delivery guy's knock either. Between the few glasses of wine and carefree attitude of the night though, we didn't really pay it much mind. It was my roommate's turn to pay this week. I'll call her Meg for the purposes of the story. Out of the group, she was the smallest, less than 5 feet tall. She was also the most naive, trusting person I've ever met. She ran up to her room to grab her wallet. This took at most 30 seconds. During this time, the banging continued and was getting even more aggressive. I figured maybe it was cold or he had other shit to do, so we yelled at her to hurry up. The banging, though, continued to get harder and harder, and I started to feel a bit uneasy. When she came back down, I told her not to open the door just yet. Check the peephole before opening it, as she was usually the one to just open it up the most. She got to the door and peeked out the peephole. She got to the door and tried to peek out the peephole, but she could barely reach it on a good day. When she said she couldn't see anything, my other roommate and I got up to help her. My second roommate, Jess, was kind of a funny gal. There are very few things she would not turn into a joke. She got to the door before I did and looked out the peephole. The person on the other side was still banging away. The way she turned to look at me, I instantly knew something was wrong. She looked confused, a look I had rarely ever seen on her, as she was very clever. Within a second, she went back to look. This time, she looked afraid. This made my stomach knot up. She was not a person to scare easily. "I think someone is covering the peephole," she whisper shouted at us. This time, I looked out too, and yeah, something was covering up the peephole so we couldn't see outside. We could still see the porch light shining through the window at the top, so we knew it was not a case of being too dark to see what was going on outside. By now, our other roommate, who I'll call Annie, walked down the hall trying to find out what was going on. She was easily the drunkest of the four of us. Even sober though, she seemed to always think she was invincible. "What's your problem, guys? Open the door. The poor dude has his hands full already." Jess and I explained what was going on. That's when Jess was sober enough to ask Meg to check the website she had ordered our food on. Meg was so drunk she'd never even placed the order. She had selected our food but never finished the last step. The banging continued as the situation started to sink in. Anne was so drunk though, she still seemed to not grasp what was happening and went to go unlock the door. "Stop!" I snapped at her. Immediately I knew I had been too loud. For the first time, the person on the other side of the door spoke. "Ma'am, this is the police. Open the door now. We have some questions for you." That sobered me up right away. I looked over at Meg, who was already welling up and panicking, then at Jess, who had gone completely pale and was no help either. The banging was getting increasingly harder, to the point we could physically see the door banging in with each hit. Meg took Anne upstairs trying to calm each other down and check if there really was a police car parked outside. They made sure our windows were locked too. Though it was hard to do, there was a possible area to get onto part of our roof that made it possible to get to Anne's window. We heard a window slam, immediately knowing it had been Anne's. Being a bit of a thrill seeker, Anne had jumped out her window screen in order to sit on the roof and check out the situation. "Show me your badge and then we'll open the door," I yelled back. Instead of a response though, the man started to try and kick in the door. I told Jess to call the police and ask if they had an officer dispatched to our address. She was shaking so badly it was hard for her to dial. Now Meg had come back downstairs, sharing that there was no police car parked outside. Anne trailed behind her, standing on the stairs trying to get a look outside the window at the top of the door. At that moment my blood ran cold. I just remembered the man at the other side of the door had said "we," not "I." Jess came to the same realization. She sprinted to our back door, a large sliding glass door, which she double-checked was locked. Thankfully it was. She drew the curtains shut as well, trying to minimize the chance of them seeing in. Within just a minute, knocking started at our back door as well. Thank God she closed the curtains, because the idea of seeing whoever was doing this still gives me chills. "Uncover the peephole and show me your badge," I yelled again, trying to sound as intimidating as I could. We were met with sudden silence, so much worse than the previous banging. "What's your badge number at least? Prove to us that you're the police," I screamed, trying to keep my voice from breaking. The only response I got back was a very quiet, I can't do that. Jess handed her phone off to Meg, who was sobbing now trying to speak to the dispatcher. The banging coming from both sides of the house must have been heard by them. They asked if someone was trying to break in. Meg frantically asked if the police had been sent yet. The answer, we all knew by now, was no. Meg babbled that at least 2 people were trying to get us to unlock the door by impersonating officers. The operator then told us police would be there in no more than 10 minutes. That made us all even more wary. We realized just how long 10 minutes really is. The door was now being hit so hard, I was worried it would actually break the frame. Jessie ran toward our back door, making me worry perhaps our kitchen window had been left open. Trying to think, I slammed a chair underneath the doorknob, hoping the door would hold now. Jessie came back to the front door, holding a kitchen knife and a fire extinguisher. We had nothing to really deter whoever wanted in. No prods and no backup until the real police showed up. It was not anything like they were used to. All of them had grown up having family as neighbors their entire life. If anything were happening, their uncles and grandfathers were at their front door in a minute flat. Now, the invincible farm girl attitude was long gone. Everyone was scared. There was only some wood and glass keeping these men out now. And with the force of the hits against the back door, I was worried the glass would break any moment. "Open the fucking door!" the man yelled at us, not even pretending to be police anymore. Then it got silent again. The only worse thing than what was happening in that moment was not knowing where the men were now. The idea of both men moving to the glass back door made me terrified. If they really wanted to, they could easily smash through that plate glass. After, there was no more knocking at the back door though. Within seconds, the front door was being slammed even harder. I was trying to wrap my mind around why they would leave the easiest entry point for a heavy wooden door. Then I realized the back door was visible by the main road. Whether they'd seen a car or heard us talking to the police, they were smart enough to move to the other entrance. Jess then said something I hadn't thought of at the moment. "I don't think they want to rob us, guys. There are houses all around us that are empty, so why did they come to the only house with the lights on?" My whole body went cold. I didn't have an answer. Meg started hyperventilating. The 3 of us stayed quiet for a minute, awful scenarios running through our minds. Anne moved back up the last steps and out of sight of us. The operator, who we'd forgotten was on speaker, spoke, which practically made me jump out of my skin. "The police are just 2 minutes away. They have their sirens turned off and the lights are on. You should see them very soon. Stay on the phone with me so I can confirm when they're outside for you." The men outside were starting to get desperate. The sound of glass suddenly shattering had me turning back to the back door. I was fully expecting someone to burst in. The door was still intact though. Instead, our porch light, the only thing illuminating our area, was suddenly put out. We put 2 and 2 together. They had destroyed the only way we would have been able to identify who was on the other side. "You fucking little whores." A voice we hadn't heard before suddenly shouted through the door as well, much worse than the initial speaker. It was full of hate and venom. It scared me more than the other person. This person had a goal. I didn't like how this sounded. Up until this point, I could have possibly convinced myself they just wanted our things, but this voice made me understand they wanted us. To this day, I've never heard someone come close to that level of malice. It sounded like he hated us for some reason. Somehow, I wish the first man would speak again instead of this guy. Until now, I had done a half-decent job of hiding how scared I was, but that voice ruined my ability to stay stone-faced. If they got in now, there was nothing we would be able to do to stop them. Not me, not my friends. We would have been at their complete mercy. Jess had practically stopped breathing. It was like the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. It was so quiet, it sounded like a gunshot when we heard our mailbox open. Anne suddenly ran back down the stairs. "I see the sirens, guys. They're coming down the main road now," she whispered, hoping the men didn't hear. The same man spoke again, one more time, so slowly I thought he was almost done after each word. In that same awful voice, he read out a letter addressed to the 4 of us, one our neighbor must have put in the box today. She had planned a potluck for the next week. None of us had thought to check the mailbox after we had talked to her in the driveway this morning. Jess, Meg, Anne, and LP, huh? Those are nice names. I'll be back soon, girls. Then we'll have some real fun. Tears started rolling down my face. I hadn't realized I'd started crying. I knew he meant what he said. I tried to pull my mind out of that dark pit that sentence had sent it to. I was waiting, praying the police had surprised them and caught them, hoping they wouldn't ever get the chance to come back. The silence continued. None of us dared to speak, worried we wouldn't hear if they moved to another point of entry. Instead, the silence persisted for what felt like a lifetime. The operator was the one to break it, telling us the police were now out front. She told us to stay in the house while the police searched the area. That kind person stayed on the phone with us for several more minutes, while the police searched everywhere. Finally, the real officer showed their badge through the peephole, before even knocking. They did their best not to scare us. The operator told us we had done well, and we were in good hands now. We opened the door to be met by two kind-looking, older officers who we let in. Glass shards covered our front stoop from our porch light. It looked like it had been ripped out of the wall and smashed on the concrete below. There were several cars out front of our previously quiet home. The headlights on all of them were shining down the street, toward the walking trail. We spoke to the officers who took a report from us. They asked us to describe the night's events in detail. They asked us if we'd saw the men at all, and we explained how the people had been covered up and the light had been smashed before moving away from the door. The officers advised us to speak to our landlord about, at the very least, some security cameras. An older officer then closed the pad he had been writing in and looked up at us. He then spoke a phrase that made me understand how much danger we had been in. Look, if any of you were my daughters, I would have wanted the officer to tell her, if you can get out of your lease, do it right now. These people know where you all live, and now they know the response time for us, especially after telling you they would be back. After that, they asked if we had heard a vehicle, something I hadn't considered. We didn't hear any type of motor until the police arrived. Even when Meg and Anne had gone upstairs to look for a police car, they had seen no vehicles on the street at all. That meant the men had come from the walking path, which would explain how they left without passing the police on their way back to the main road. The older officer of the two had a look that told me he had an idea of what was going on. He looked sad, which was worse than if he had looked scared. I knew he had seen this kind of situation and far worse in the past. We pushed for an explanation, but were only told it had been an issue years ago in the area and did not elaborate past that point. The officer stood up, exchanged a glance I didn't understand how to read, and then spoke again. We'll have a cruiser parked in the driveway, as well as a plain car around back. They won't have the chance to try again anytime soon. They didn't catch the man in the 2 more weeks we lived there. We had a few creepy things happen, but nothing close to this. The reality was, they had never been caught, and they could return at any time. After this night, we spoke to our landlady, who was thankfully very incredible. She owned several more properties around the city, and when we explained what had happened, she let us move to a different apartment she owned closer to campus. She told us our safety was more important than making a couple extra $100. She even left that old house empty for many months in order to make sure cameras, better locks, and reinforced doors were installed. She didn't want the people who moved in next to have to deal with anything shady either. Thankfully, those guys never came back, and we were able to enjoy our new apartment without much worry. It's still so scary to me though. Make sure to always lock your doors and check who's there before opening them. When I was probably 13, my family and I were on our way home from a Wednesday night church service. My mom was in the driver's seat, and I was behind her in the back. My 5-year-old brother was in the middle, and my 10-year-old sister on his other side. We were just down the road from the church, but it was a country road and late at night. This meant there was no light, and no one else on the road either. We were just coming up to our turn, when all of a sudden, a car came swerving from our turning spot. This little car was taking the turn so fast, they came into our lane and almost slammed right into us. We swerved as they tried to get in their own lane before we collided. Unfortunately for them, they overcorrected. Their car flipped and landed on the driver's side door in the ditch. My mom, of course, hit the brakes and immediately jumped out of the car to go help whoever was in there. She got about 3 steps away from our car before she stopped dead in her tracks. My sister and I were just sitting there, our mouths hanging wide open and having no clue what to do. All I could think to myself was, this can't be happening. This kind of stuff only happens in the movies. But why wasn't my mom going to help this person now? It was summer, so we had our windows halfway down. I could hear a person yelling for help from inside. My mom started moving again to help them, but for some reason, she stopped again in the center of the road. Another car flew past us. This guy didn't hesitate to jump out and run to the crash to help. The man got to the car and started prying the passenger door open so the man inside could climb out. I could see my mom wanted to run and help, but it was like she was rooted to the spot. That good Samaritan that pulled up behind us was able to get the door popped open. The guy from inside crawled out and got into a frog-like crouching position on top of the car. At this point, my mom started shuffling back to our vehicle. When I looked back at the man, he had this crazy look on his face. He looked directly at our car, and my mom as well. He launched himself off the top and started attacking the guy who was helping him. While that man was down, he turned and started sprinting for our car at the same time. My mom turned and made a run for it. He must have known he couldn't get there before my mom did, because he changed directions and moved to grab the car behind us. My mom jumped in and locked our doors, just as this man jumped into the empty driver's seat of that good Samaritan. He slammed on the gas before he'd even closed the door and almost hit us, taking off a second time. Next thing we know, the guy who was just carjacked ran up to my mom's window and started screaming and knocking on it. My mom was of course shaken and didn't want to roll down the window now. She settled for cracking it open just a bit so he could understand what the man was saying. He was yelling for us to call 911 because he'd left his phone in the car, along with his girlfriend. Of course, my mom started searching for her phone. She was so frantic from what had just happened, though, she couldn't seem to find it. I took a break from keeping my little brother and sister calm and dialed 911 on my own phone. While she was explaining what happened to the operator, we heard a woman screaming down the road. The man that was out our window took off running. A few minutes later, he came back with a severely scraped-up woman in his arms that turned out to be his girlfriend. My mom unlocked the doors at this point and let the woman sit in the passenger seat while we waited together for the cops. The girlfriend told us he'd noticed her while he was speeding off and tried to attack her too. She managed to scratch his eye and punched him while trying to plead with him to stop the car. He kept on trying to attack her though. Finally, he rolled down the window and pushed her out while going 60. The cops finally showed up and talked to all of us to get our stories. While talking to one officer, he told my mom the man had apparently shot and killed the man behind some apartment complex. That's why he was driving so fast and trying to get away. When we finally got home, we were all told to just go to bed. But of course, I wouldn't be able to sleep that night. I went downstairs to talk to my mom. I worked up the courage to ask her why she'd stopped running to the car when the other guy didn't. She told me she had such a strong feeling that she should stay in the car with us. It was almost like she could physically hear it. When she heard him start yelling for help, she wanted to go again, but just like last time, she got the overwhelming feeling something was wrong. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if my mom hadn't listened to that feeling. The man could have easily overpowered her and gotten to the car if she had been any further away. I should also mention that man was caught that night trying to steal a new car. He had already ditched the car he'd stolen from behind us, so the thing that really helped him get convicted was that woman fighting him off. She'd managed to grab the wrap off his head before being pushed out. She didn't even know she did because of adrenaline until the police arrived and she found it by where she was pushed. The man did go to jail, but I was never informed for how long or anything else. And honestly, I don't really care to ask. I grew up in a small, rural town where nothing ever happens. The sort of place where it wasn't unusual to leave your doors unlocked, and your closest neighbors were a mile or so away from your own house. Our family had this giant old cat, Tag. He was a bit of a drama king, but we loved him all the same. One summer, when I was around 9 or 10 years old, Tag just suddenly started going ballistic out of nowhere. Generally, he would just sleep in my room curled up next to me until I fell asleep as well. Then he would get up and do whatever cat-like things he'd do all day. Occasionally he would meow or try to wake me up on those unfortunate nights he could see the bottom of his food bowl and needed a midnight snack or something. Usually, if I just ignored him, he would give up or try to go wake up my mom instead. On this night, however, he was banging his body against my parents' bedroom door. He was meowing loud enough to wake everyone up. Our bedroom doors were all right next to each other. I called Tag to come to bed because it was now about 2 a.m. He was having none of it though. He was still just going absolutely crazy. My mom went down to the kitchen, then huffed back up with Tag on her heels, still meowing insanely. When she checked, his bowl still had plenty of food. He just walked her to the door of the kitchen and watched it. Tag was an indoor/outdoor cat, but he had his own cat door through the garage. There was no need for one of us to let him out ourselves. My mom said my brother must have left the kitchen door open or something. Just the screen door was shut. She wasn't going to hold it open forever for the cat to just stand there and not go outside though. Eventually she got fed up, shut the kitchen door and went back to sleep, firmly shutting her own bedroom door and not letting Tag back inside their room. I always kept treats for him in my own room. I offered him one, but he was still meowing at their door, trying to get them to get up. I grabbed him and brought him into my room and shut my door to try and get him to sleep. I lay in bed, trying to go back to bed. Tag just kept meowing at my door, wanting to go back out. Finally, I got fed up and opened my door. He bolted right back downstairs, towards the kitchen, and that's when I heard what sounded like a door slamming. I have 3 older siblings, so someone was always up watching TV or running to the bathroom or something. At first, I didn't think anything of it. The cat finally stalked back into my room, but instead of curling up in my armpit like usual, he sat at the bottom of my bed, staring vigilantly at my door. I fell asleep until morning, when some commotion woke me up. I padded my way down to the kitchen to find my parents on the phone with the police. They got up as usual to get ready for work, and while making coffee, my mom went to grab her rings from the little jewelry dish she had by the sink. She would take them off in the evenings to rinse dishes and load the dishwasher, but discovered that that tray was empty this morning. It was a small town, so the sheriff sent a deputy over right away. When my dad walked out to meet with them, he saw the ATV was missing from out back as well, and the key was off the ring. My brothers were all up at this point too. We were all freaked out that while we were just sleeping there, some robber had entered our home, removed the ATV key, and even saw an opportunity to steal my mom's rings. They were asking if we had any clue when it happened, and my parents said no. My mom asked my middle brother, who was a freshman in college and home for the summer, what time he'd ended up off the couch last night, and if he'd heard anything. He'd gone to bed at 10 or 11 and asked what she meant, as his bedroom was in the basement. He wouldn't have heard anything in the kitchen. My mom then said something odd. "But you were in the living room just off the kitchen when I went to feed the cat and shut the door. You left it open, remember? I told you not to sleep on the couch anymore and to go back to bed when I went upstairs." He told my mom he was already in the basement since dinner time and never went out to come upstairs again. He'd watched a movie in the basement instead, before falling asleep in his own bedroom. She went white and realized the cat must have been trying to warn us someone was in our house. The robber had dove onto the couch and covered up to hide when she came to the kitchen. He'd exited right after she went back to bed. The cops said that for someone to be so brazen, they probably knew our family, knew our habits, but didn't count on the fact that the cat was so overprotective. They had probably intended to do more, but were afraid the cat may have woken the whole house. It's been over 20 years since this happened. The robber was never caught. It's unnerving to think it was probably someone who had been in our home before as a friend. Okay, I guess I should start this story by giving a bit of background so you understand the situation a bit better. I'm a 4'9" girl. I was 16 years old at the time this happened. We had 2 dogs who were brothers from the same litter. Being boxers, they were relatively big and quite protective when need arise. Vince was longer and much taller than his brother, and was usually the kind to sleep through a hurricane if there ever was one. His brother Maury was shorter but more muscled, stronger I guess I'd say. Usually these two were with me 24/7, as my mother used to work quite a lot. This meant I was usually alone most of the day, sometimes even well after dark. This never really bothered me though. I'd been left alone at home like this since I was 11 years old. It never really struck me I'd have any reason to be worried. One day, my mom was working quite a bit later. I was doing some household chores, feeding the dogs, doing dishes, random house care stuff like that. I continued doing what I usually did, a routine of tidying the house I'd grown accustomed to every day for years. As I went to take the trash out of the bins though, I started walking toward the door when Maury stepped in front of me suddenly. I tried to move around him, telling him to get out of my way, but he refused to budge no matter what. This was certainly odd. Looking back on it now, a few years later, I realized he must have been trying to stop me from walking outside. We continued like this for a few moments, me trying to move past him, and him, of course, never moving from his spot. He was quite heavy as a big dog, so it was difficult to move him around, even harder to get him away from something. In the time we'd been going back and forth with this interaction, Vince had stayed happily asleep on his dog bed. I should note that from my kitchen, you can see the living room and bathroom. Usually we use the slide door from the kitchen to enter and exit the house, since it was attached to the carport. After a couple more minutes though, I heard something I never expected when I made one last desperate attempt to move Maury out of the way. He growled, which wasn't unusual. He'd growled plenty in his life. What was unusual though was that he was growling at me. He had never done that before, not even once. For that simple reason alone, I decided against taking the trash out that night. I simply tossed it in another room and left it to take out in the morning. A short time passed, maybe a half hour or so. I'd gotten settled into my chair to watch some movie while I waited for my mom to finally arrive home. While I was sitting there in the quiet ambiance of that movie, I suddenly heard a very faint knock at the side door. As I mentioned before, you can clearly see the living room from the kitchen, so I heard the knock pretty well even though it was so quiet. It was already well after dark. I figured maybe it was just my mother, and she'd somehow forgotten her keys or something. I got up and started to go to the kitchen, when out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the key hook near the door. The keys were not there. To some people, that may not be a big deal, but to me, that meant for sure the person knocking on my door at night was in fact not my mother. My mom was a bit of a routine, obsessed person, so if she'd actually forgotten something, they'd be right where she left them. I took a deep breath, preparing myself to just not answer the door, or if they didn't leave, to tell them I wasn't interested and to go away right now. Thinking back on it, I really wish I hadn't even looked out the window on the door. I wish I just sat back down, called my mom, and stayed out of sight. Of course, I walked in front of the door, and immediately came face to face with a figure on the other side of the window. Now, it was really dark, mind you, with just my neighbor's light shining from his porch. I could only make out a couple of things about this guy because of this. He was tall. I had to peer up at him through the window to even glance at his face. He had extremely long hair that looked like a shadow over his shoulders in the dim light. The only facial features I could make through his messy hair were his eyes. I wish I hadn't seen them. I could see the spark of interest flare up in them as he perked up when he saw who I was. They grew creepily wide, and he began to stare down at me. He took a step towards my door. I heard him say something along the lines of, My car broke down nearby. Can I come in and use your phone? Immediately, I thought of every bad thing I'd ever heard happening to a teenager home alone and tried to compose my nerves. I can't put my finger on exactly what it was, but something was telling me not to let this man standing on the other side of my door do anything. I shouted back a quick no and an apology. I hoped he was telling the truth and would simply go to the next house over. He didn't, though. He simply said the exact same thing again, quite a bit louder now. I thought for a quick moment he hadn't heard me. Now I know better, though. I answered back a little more confidently. I'm sorry, I can't help you. Go to the next house. For a moment he paused, as if contemplating what to do. He stared me right in the eyes, and then began to knock again, slowly getting louder than the first time I'd heard it. My heart rate increased as I stared back at him. When I didn't react, he started to loudly slam against the door. I took a step back, praying to whatever god I could he would either leave or my mom would get home early. I was usually a quiet girl. My mom was a redneck with a raptor knife, though, so maybe she could take him. He started to bang on the glass after a moment. My mind was racing 1,000 miles an hour. What should I do? Run? My phone was in another room, but I was scared to take my eyes off this man. I was sure he would break the glass immediately as soon as I did so. The banging was vibrating my eardrums, and apparently it had woken Maury up too. I saw him creeping up past the doorway, teeth bared. He started to growl loudly. The man stopped for a moment, trying to see into the window at the floor where Maury stood. When he stopped barking for a moment, the man tried to force the door handle. That's when Vince went crazy. I swear to God, for a dog that was dead asleep not even 5 seconds prior, I'd never seen him move that fast ever. In only 2 seconds, Vince had his paws up against the door, growling like a hellhound at this man outside my home. The man was very clearly startled. He fell back on his ass and bolted away. I heard him say something as he started to run and saw another shadow move from outside my view. My mom came home shortly after I sprinted across my carport to my neighbor's. We called the police after I explained what happened, and my neighbor grabbed his shotgun out before they even got there. He insisted on looking for the guy himself. I had to stop him even. The police said someone had tried to pick the lock on my front door too, but there was a lot of stuff in front of it and it was really old, so it didn't open anymore. I went to bed that night uneasy and very grateful I had 2 dogs who were not only strong and big, but were vigilant and would practically kill for me if I would have let them. A few weeks went by and we hadn't heard anything from the cops, so eventually I stopped trying to think about it. Another month went by, and although I was still a bit scared of being home alone, nothing else seemed to happen. Then we got another visit from the cops. What they told me made my heart sink in my chest, and still gives me chills to this day. They had caught the guys, and it turned out they had been stalking me. And yes, guys, plural. There were 2 that had been apparently stalking me everywhere, without my knowledge for months. They had several photos of me, with words they had written over them. The police had been fairly adamant I change my locks. They'd caught the 2 guys from that incident, but there was evidence of a 3rd man being involved as well. We moved shortly thereafter, needless to say. I still pass by that house sometimes. When I go to visit friends or do stuff around that area, a chill runs down my spine every time. To think they never caught one of the guys was scary enough. The fact they tried to break into my house was worse. But the worst thing was that I hadn't even known they were fully watching me. I still think about it now, even a few more years later. I dread what would have happened if my dogs hadn't been there. And I dread even worse about what they planned to do if I just opened the door or they had successfully broken in. I suppose they weren't expecting my dogs, since our backyard is fenced and they mostly stayed indoors. I thank the universe every day I had them with me. My mom never worked until after dark again after that, which in all honesty was just fine with me. I used to work at a small neighborhood gas station. I was working an opening shift at 6 a.m. with my best friend / coworker. We were doing our normal opening things. As the sun came up, I went to get some ice from out the back. For reference, the gas station building used to have a drive-thru, so we had that kind of drive-thru window back there as well. I happened to glance at the back window before going out, only to do a double take when I realized there was a literal bloody handprint on that window. I looked closer. There were smudges of blood around the window handle. It looked like someone had definitely been attempting to force it open. We were both really freaked out now, needless to say. We went to look around the other potential entrances of the building. I looked at the window in front and noticed dried blood on the hole where we take money for gas from outside. Someone had been trying to stick their hand in to get something inside for some reason. I kept on looking around further. Dried blood on the front door handles. Splatters of blood on the glass like someone had been pounding on it. My friend and I were both freaking out at this point. Luckily, I had access to the security cameras. I checked on them for any motion detected during the night. At around 5 a.m., there was a motion capture. We watched as a man with his entire body covered in blood walked around the store trying to find a way to get in. The freakiest thing was, usually the store opened at 5 a.m., but this just so happened to be Sunday, and we opened at 6 instead. Really dodged a bullet there. There were police lights in the distance on the cameras, so we called the sheriff to see what was going on. He showed up pretty quick, watched the security footage, and confirmed it was a guy they'd picked up just a bit after 5:30, just before we got there. That was the craziest thing that happened to me in my 3.5 years of working at gas stations. My name is Leia. I live in the north of France in one of the houses in a family neighborhood. I was 15 years old when this story happened. My parents were separating. My mother was a nurse, so I was often left at home alone. It was November of 2021, I believe. It would get much darker much earlier around that time, so that meant I was home alone in absolute darkness. Around 7 p.m., I heard some knocking at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone to come by though. I was paralyzed in surprise. A few minutes later, the knocking repeated. I looked in the peephole of my door, but I couldn't see anyone there. I thought it must be a prank by children in my neighborhood or something. The knocking stopped just a few moments later, and nothing else happened for 4 more days. It was a Saturday this time. I had invited 2 of my girlfriends to my house, Luis and Satine. That day, my mother was at work. We were watching a movie in my living room when I went to pick up my charger in my room. My 2 friends were alone downstairs when they heard those same knocks as the night before. Their first thought was that my mother was coming home early. They didn't know about that previous incident. They opened the door, only to see no one was there once more. The 3 of us were confused. We didn't know what was going on. Luis reassured us though, telling us surely we were creating this stress in our heads. Maybe it was just a coincidence with that knocking from last night. The rest of the evening went over quite well, and nobody knocked for the rest of that night. That's what I told myself at least, until next Wednesday night. I'd just come back home from the grocery store after buying some pasta. After eating, I went back to my room to finish my homework with my headphones in. I was listening to some music. Suddenly, I began to hear banging against the walls. Naturally, at first, I thought this was my rabbit, getting angry and thumping because he was hungry. After a few blows, though, I could hear things moving around on their own. I took courage with both hands and decided to bravely go down to the living room. In the reflection of the mirror in the hallway, I saw the silhouette of a man tapping on my window with a crowbar. I was petrified. The man still hadn't seen me. He then came to knock on the door, the exact same patterns as the other 2 times with his crowbar. Still grasping all my courage best I could, I grabbed a knife. I quietly walked over to the front door. The man was tapping with his crowbar louder and louder. I shouted through the door, telling him to get fucked, and that I was already on the phone with the police. As soon as he heard that, he ran away, and he didn't come back after. As soon as he left, I really did call the police. I was bluffing when he ran away. After hanging up, I cried. I thought that would have been the last moments of my life. He looked like he was about to try and break the window in. 10 minutes later, a patrol arrived, but they couldn't do anything except patrol regularly around my home. The man was never caught or arrested. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't heard the noises that day. This was the moment when I was most scared in my entire life, and it changed everything for me. Let me start by saying this is something I've had to go through, and there are still some things about it I don't really understand. I don't talk about this to anyone in my personal life, really. Not because of how painful it is, mind you, but I just don't like people's reactions to it. No matter how well-intentioned the other person is, it tends to alter relationships permanently. And though, over the past 21 years, I've learned to talk about what really happened, I'll tell it from my perspective from back then, the way I remember it. I lived with my mom at the time. My parents had been divorced for 3 years, which for a 7-year-old is pretty much your entire life. My mom back then was someone who took extra care with me. She didn't like it when I played in the yard. She didn't like it when I spent a lot of time at our neighbor's house. Always personally dropped me off at school and was waiting for me at the end of the day to take me home. She taught me to lock all 3 locks on our door and how to see what different cars were parked outside and which ones were familiar. Of course, stranger danger. She was, I now understand, paranoid. There's lots more things, but I'll just skip all that. One night we were sitting on the couch watching TV when a small pickup truck pulled into our driveway. This was really strange. We weren't expecting anyone. Even worse, though, was my mom's reaction. I'd never seen her move so fast. She leapt up from the couch to make sure the door was locked. Then she ran to me, picked me up hard, and carried me to her bedroom and back. She told me to hide underneath the bed. She ran out of the room and closed the door behind her. I heard a man pounding on the front door. Then she started yelling and screaming at him. All of a sudden there was a giant crash. Moments later, the bedroom door flew open and my mom ran inside. There was a big man behind her. I could see the cuffs of his jeans and the toes of his black and brown shoes. My mom was screaming. She tried to turn around and slam the bedroom door shut, but suddenly it pushed open and she was thrown onto the bed right above me. The heels of her bare feet were by my head, hovering just a few inches off the floor, and the man's shoes were in the doorway. There was complete silence for a moment before my mom started to quaver audibly. I heard 2 really loud pops, and nothing moved. The man's feet ran away. I heard his truck start and pull out of the driveway. I waited for my mom to come and get me. Her feet slid down to touch the floor, and the rest of her did too. Her hair was all messy and frizzy. She had her back turned to me, curled with her knees against her chest, and her nightshirt was up in her armpits. I put my hand on her back and was about to ask her if she was okay when I saw a pool of liquid coming toward me from under her body. I flew away from her, out from under the bed and onto the other side of the room. I was probably screaming at her or something. It seemed like just a few seconds had passed, pressed hard against the wall as I could with my face buried against the baseboard, before I began to hear sirens. It was a big city, so I was used to that noise, but it got louder and louder. Now more feet ran through the front door and into my house. I thought the man had come back. I heard people yelling police and thought that's what I needed. I needed the police right now. The rest of the night, feet stomping, blankets wrapped around me, I was whisked past my mom so I couldn't see her. I remember really wanting to tell them to help her, but I couldn't find a way to get the words out. It took a long time for me to forgive myself for that. Of course, they were going to help her. They put her into an ambulance while I stood on the front lawn and watched. I followed in a police car behind. Never really got the chance to see her again. They said she died in the ambulance. I saw her at the funeral, of course, but that wasn't really her. The questions answered later don't really help that much, but here they are. My dad had cheated on my mom, and my mom cheated on my dad in revenge. The guy she was with decided to leave his own wife for my mom. My dad left because everything was so messed up. My mom felt really guilty and broke it off with the guy. He was very upset with how she'd ruined his life. She had been worried about him for years after. He found her through a mutual friend, and that was that. The man went back to his apartment after and killed himself too. There was a lot of time with the police. I talked to a lady in a room in front of a camera. My dad came and took me to his house to live with him. It was an extremely confusing time. I realized in that moment there are two English languages, one that kids speak and one that adults speak, and only adults are fluent in both. They would have conversations with me in that foreign tongue, going above my head, then switch to child language and say, "Now tell us what you saw. You're going to live with me now," and stuff like that. That's my scary story. My dad really wasn't all that into kids. I just kinda pulled inside myself and worked on school. I went to college, have a good job, have good friends, all of that. But I've learned not to speak about this. The internet is great for anonymously talking about things. But I'm not sure if this really helps anyone. It's just a sad and scary story. I've spent most of my life only talking about this to therapists. And despite what you might think of seeing it on TV, it's actually really helpful. I remember every moment of that night, every breath, every footstep, every loud noise and whimper, and I always will. So I made this friend on Reddit named Carl. I met Carl because we frequented a lot of the same subreddits and would always seem to bump into each other in different threads. I used to be quite active on the site, but now I mostly browse every now and then. Carl private messaged me drunk one night, saying he needed a friend but had no one else to talk to, and that he needed to vent some shit about his life. I obliged him and we swiftly became friends. Then we even became pen pals. We'd email every day pretty much, or message each other on Discord. We shared and talked about all kinds of things. We vented about our lives, about our personal situations. As far as I knew, Carl was a couple of years older than me, originally from Russia, but now living in Colorado. He had a child and a girlfriend as well, it seemed. He'd posted various pictures of himself in different places, and he'd also posted a lot on the genealogy subreddit with his DNA results. Eventually though, as time continued on, Carl started getting mad whenever I didn't reply quickly enough, and he started acting quite strange as well. Things were still fine though for the most part. He seemed to love drama, and reveled in talking shit about people, so he would do that quite a lot. I very quickly noticed as well that he was extremely paranoid about many things. I didn't take this too seriously at first. At one point, I made a forum based on 2007 LiveJournal, where we'd basically just post stories of our lives every day. This other random person joined it, John, who was apparently already friends with Carl. They both claimed that they went to the same high school. It had been about a year of friendship at this point, when I started to notice that some of Carl's stories weren't exactly adding up, and neither were John's actually. Something seemed to be a little bit off here, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. We still continued being friends, and I got somewhat close to both Carl and John. I must confess though that I did lie to them a bit. I never gave them my real name. I said I lived in Wyoming as well, even though I lived nowhere near there. I just looked up some random information on a city in Wyoming and claimed I lived there. Other than that though, most of the things I told them were true. I was just concerned for privacy reasons. For some reason I didn't quite understand. I didn't want these two to know exact names and details. Carl could be really creepy obsessive sometimes. He would look up different websites to see shit I'd posted and then deleted, and ask me why I'd removed it. I started to get even more suspicious. At one point, I decided to try something. I sent a link on Facebook to both Carl and John. You could only see it though if you joined a private group, which meant you had to use your real Facebook account. John ended up joining. I found out he lived in New Hampshire, nowhere near where Carl lived. I messaged him and asked if he really did go to school with Carl. He claimed that he did, but immediately after I asked, he told Carl I'd been snooping around. I forget exactly how the rest of this went down, but at one point I had sent a picture of an art piece I'd done to Carl. Now that he knew I was looking into him, in the background was my cat, with her tag visible as well. Carl blew up the photo, zoomed in, and saw my mother's phone number on the tag. He used Spokio to find her, then found her Facebook, then found me. Carl then confronted me, saying he knew where I really lived, my real name, my address, and knew everything about my mom as well. He asked why I'd lied, and threatened me for lying to him. He said he was tracking me down and going to get revenge for trying to track John down too. He tried to backpedal and claim that was a joke, but I could tell he was really being serious. I was so creeped out I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to ask him to talk to me himself and try to figure out a way to resolve things peacefully. He made up a bunch of excuses as to why he couldn't do that. I found out that his name was not Carl. He was also not from Colorado. The pictures were not of him, of course, and most of the details he'd told me were absolutely fake. He was not even Russian. His entire online profile was completely fabricated. I'm not even sure whose life he was trying to fake in that case. And John? He barely even knew Carl. For whatever reason, he just decided to help Carl lie to me and track me down. He was the one that helped Carl find all my information. John's real name was John, in fact, and that was indeed his real Facebook that I'd found, but I couldn't find out anything about who Carl was. Carl began to tell me he knew everything about me, but I knew nothing about him. He was going to find the people in my life and try to make it a living hell. I ghosted him and tried my best to remove my presence from online. As far as I know, he never messed with my family or my girlfriend. He never shipped anything dangerous to my house like he said he would or anything like that. We just never spoke again after. It's definitely creepy as fuck that some stranger knew everything about me, but I knew nothing about them. I guess I got lucky in the end that he wasn't really serious about doing something bad to me. I'm a woman. At the time of this tale, I was 27 years old. I was living with my boyfriend, now fiancé, in the same home we live in today, in fact. Our home is a small beach cottage with multiple windows on all sides. The home was moved in the 70s from a rural beach town just a few miles from here to our quaint neighborhood amongst the sprawling brick branches, in what I imagine at the time to be a desirable little working-class neighborhood on the edge of town. Around the time of my story, my boyfriend would make frequent trips out of town, often for work purposes, but also on occasion to assist his older parents who lived out of state. He'd help them with repairs, remodeling, etc. This typically meant he'd be gone for a few weeks, but sometimes up to 2 months at a time even. At this point, he'd been out of town for a week or so. I was just going along with my day-to-day life like normal. Going to work at my 9 to 5, working out in the evening, doing some chores, rinse and repeat every day. One night as I was lying in bed, on the very cusp of my sleepy melatonin stupor, suddenly I was jolted wide awake with an overwhelming feeling to get up and check all the windows were locked right away. Even in my groggy state, I thought that was such a strange impulse. Other than the fact I hadn't checked the window since my boyfriend had left, I had no logical reason to think to do that right now. I didn't hear any strange sounds, I didn't see anything weird, nothing of that nature. Begrudgingly, I drug myself from my cozy cocoon, though, to go and check all the windows. Most were locked up tight, but there were a few that had in fact been left unlocked. I threw the lock latches that had been left unsecured, and groggily stumbled back to bed, not thinking anything else about it as I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, as usual, I woke up to my alarm blaring from my phone and began to prepare myself for work. I just started a water kettle for my beloved French press when I stood at the kitchen window waiting for the whistle. My entire body was instantly coated in goosebumps as I noticed a single clean slice in my kitchen window screen. Utterly shocked, I ran to the office, then the guest room, then the laundry room. As I'm sure you've already guessed, every single screen in my home had a clean slice through it, a slice just large enough to fit someone's hand through. All but 3 out of the 18 windows in my house had been tampered with. The 3 that were left untouched were the windows to my bedroom. The bedroom I'd been peacefully sleeping my butt off in while someone was attempting to break into my house. By this time, my kettle was screeching at me to remove it from the heat. I ran to the kitchen to answer the kettle's call while attempting to not keel over from a second heart attack I was having before even dressed. Needless to say, I was freaked out beyond measure. The cops were called and a detective came out to investigate. On the back side of my house, he noticed a single handprint on one of the windows. He tried to test for fingerprints, but it was determined the person attempting to break in had been wearing gloves. He of course had no proof, but he also believed the person must have known I was in that room. Nothing ever came of the investigation. I can't explain why I suddenly got the urge to get out of bed that night, but I know to trust my gut now. Back a while ago, I used to date this particular guy. After about 6 months of dating or so, he started being gone for hours at a time, with no way to communicate with him at all. Cell phones weren't really a thing back then. Sometimes he did do deliveries out of state, but it only happened every couple of months. At first, I didn't really think anything of it. He always had a perfectly prepped excuse for everything. Sometimes he'd come back smelling like chemicals. He'd come over to my house and shower, then change clothes as soon as he walked in the door. I never met his parents. I never met any of his friends. One day, I noticed his work gloves were kinda stained and rough looking. I just mentioned that he needed some new gloves and didn't really think anything about it. He began to get progressively more creepy, until I finally decided I'd had enough and broke it off with him. He harassed me for weeks after. I had to change my phone number and email address. When he found out my work information, he started calling and emailing me there too. I did my best to try and ignore him. After a while, it just stopped altogether. A month goes by. My car was broken into at work, and they took the change from the cup holder, OTC meds, and my registration. I worked downtown and assumed it was some junkies at the time. About a week later, though, suddenly I was woken up in the middle of the night to someone right on top of me. I could feel their rough gloves wrapped around my neck, and my heart was beating a mile a minute. Luckily for me, my friend just so happened to show up banging at the door that exact moment. My would-be rapist/murderer ran to the sliding glass door, opened it easily, and climbed down the balcony of my apartment. He took off into the night. My friends knew they could come to my house to sleep off a wild night and call me if they needed a ride home. Because of this, it was not an unusual occurrence for someone to show up on a Friday or Saturday night. Lucky for me, this was pre-Uber and Lyft, and cabs were gross and expensive. I drove my friend home and stayed there for a few days. I moved after and got a different job as well. While I still lived in an apartment, I kept my registration and my purse after that. I swear the person who did that was my ex, and I never heard from him again after. My friends Jessica and James have been together for roughly 6 years, and they've lived in their house for over a year now. I'm over quite often as well. I've been friends and co-workers with Jessica for 4 years. They're both wonderful people, and they've kind of adopted me into their family. They keep me alive by feeding me a few times a week, so I'm very grateful to them. I was over for dinner after work a few weeks ago. We all arrived at their place within minutes of each other. We all drank and caught up, and after a little while, James went outside to grill up some steaks. He came inside, though, and asked why I'd kissed the door. I was pretty confused, of course. I went over to the sliding glass door where he was. Sure as the world is round, there was a kiss print on the outside of the door, lipstick and everything. Few things first. James and Jessica are both shorter than I am. He's about 5'8" and she's 5'2". I'm 5'11". The kiss print was at a height that if I popped up my balls on my feet, I could just barely reach that spot with my lips, far above where either of them could reach. I hadn't worn any of that sort of stuff in many, many years. They both thought it was me playing a prank on them for some reason. Jessica on the lipstick. I guess they thought I could have just been trying to freak them out or something. Spoiler alert, it was not me. I happen to be a smoker, so I did frequent their back porch through that door. I guess that made it all the more suspicious. Their porch was pretty difficult to get to as well. We got 3 sides, right? Well, the right side is a 30-foot drop, the left side is a 10-foot drop with a spiked fence, and inside that fence is immediately James' grill and some workout equipment. It was a pretty narrow, not easily navigated space. The front of the porch, I suppose, would be the easiest way to get in, but you'd have to be quite dedicated to climb all that way. They had real thick, tall hedges around the entire thing, too. You'd get pretty scraped up trying to do all this. At this point, I was thinking Jessica had just climbed up on a chair and was trying to prank me or something. James cleaned off the glass, and we quickly went on with our night. A few nights later, though, I'm back at their place. I was going outside for a smoke when I saw another kiss mark on the glass, in the same place as before. About a foot below that was a smudgy heart drawn in dirt crudely. I'm not sure if this person had really greasy hands or if they used spit or something, but that was extra creepy. I pointed this out to my friends, and again they thought it was me. James even insisted I clean it off. None of us were the type to prank exactly. I still felt the most logical explanation was Jessica was doing this for some reason. The next time it happened, a few days later, I hadn't been there for a while. Jessica called me up. She was a little bit accusatory and rattled, of course. I did have a key to their home. She asked me if I had used it to go inside and write something on the glass again, because when they'd woken up, they noticed some writing on the door. I told her it was not me. She let it go, but I could still tell she was kind of suspicious. At this point, I knew it wasn't her either. It could be, but she would have given up the ghost already. She seemed to be genuinely mad and scared of me. It didn't seem funny at all. It happened many more times as well. Once even when I was over there. Then there was a break for about a week. Then it started up in earnest when I wasn't there for a while. I had to go to another state for work. While I was gone, Jessica video called me. She saw I was in my hotel room, not there, and just started freaking out. She said this whole time she'd really been holding out hope it was me. At least then it wouldn't be terrifying. Alas, I was 1,000 miles away. There was new writing on her back door, seemingly made that very same night, with a heart drawn underneath as well. She apologized to me for being so adamant it was me. She just hadn't wanted to be wrong. I told her it was okay, but also told her the person she should really be calling right now was the police. She did call them. They came several hours later, looked around for 5 minutes, and pretty much just told her, "Hey, that's weird." They told her she could take some pictures and submit them online. Wow, thanks guys, what a big help. We were all completely freaked out. We don't really know what's going on. They ordered a camera and it came a couple of days ago. They put it on the porch, but so far nothing. I'll let you know if anything further happens. About 10 years ago, after graduating from high school, me and 5 of my friends, all girls by the way, decided we were going to rent out a house together right by campus. We were all fairly young, 17 to 19 years old, and very broke as well. The house wasn't exactly in the best neighborhood. One night, we had some people over. Nothing crazy, just a few of our friends. We were all hanging out on our front porch and having a few beers together. We called it a night around 1 or 2 a.m. All of our friends went home and we all went to bed. The next morning, we were woken very startlingly to a knock from the police. One of the girls let us know the cops were at our door, so we all came downstairs in a panic. Naturally, we thought we were in some sort of trouble. The officer informed us there had been some sketchy activity on our front porch last night. At first, we thought he was talking about us having a party with people over, but no. Apparently, sometime after we'd gone to bed, there was a man in his late 40s or early 50s, looking through all our windows. The officer had just happened to be driving by and saw the man peering in. When the man saw the officer, he frantically grabbed an empty beer can off our front porch and sat down on one of our chairs. He pretended to be drinking. The officer obviously thought this was even stranger, so he stopped to see what was going on here. He asked the man if he lived in the house. The man had told him he was a close friend of ours and that all of us had just turned in for the night. He'd decided to finish his beer before he took off. He started describing things about us in a horrifying amount of detail, even some things he shouldn't have known. It seemed he'd been watching us for some time. I'm sure the officer could tell some sketchy shit was going on here, as he offered to give the man a ride to wherever he lived. The man hesitated for a moment and insisted he simply wanted to finish his beer. The cop just told him to come with him. When he did a search of the man's name, tons of charges came up. The scariest part was all the charges of pedophilia he had, quite a lot of them. Thank God for that officer driving by. We checked our windows the next day, only to find they'd been unlocked, and some of them had been tampered with. This guy would have had no trouble at all climbing through one of those windows while we were asleep. Needless to say, we made sure every window was secure in that house, and we were a lot more cautious of our surroundings from then on. The cop actually gave us the name of the man, so we could look him up along with all of his pages of charges. This guy was terrifying. One of those people where you can just tell from the look in their eyes that they're not someone you want to associate with. Still gives me the chills to think about. Another good old story from South Africa. As people from there might know, there are a lot of game farms, lodges, and those sites of facilities, especially around the area of Kruger National Park. This incident took place on a very tranquil 4-star game farm close to the southern tip of the aforementioned park. We frequented this lodge often over the 5 years before this incident. It was a favorite with me and my wife actually, who was at the time still my girlfriend. The lodge had a very nice central area, with a pool, restaurant, and then tented chalets were spread around, with the furthest one about 1 kilometer from the restaurant. They were very private and set up in the bush as well. You couldn't see the next one over because of this, and could only really hear your neighbors if they were very loud. Sadly, the lodge had fallen on some hard times and gone backwards a bit. The weekend this incident took place, only 2 of the 25-plus units were occupied for that Friday night, and we were the only ones there on Saturday. Honestly, that made me feel a little bit uneasy. To make matters even worse, the lodge/farm manager came by on Saturday morning, saying he would be leaving for the weekend as well. He told us if we needed anything to just help ourselves to the restaurant fridges and leave a note. We could settle the bill at a later time. Sure, no problem, I guess. We had the pool and jacuzzi and the rest of the facilities all to ourselves. We left to go for a visit to the KMP after the manager left and stayed out most of the day. We got back around 3 p.m., and right as we got out of the car, I immediately got goosebumps. It was 35 degrees Celsius out, over 100 degrees in Fahrenheit, so I definitely was not getting those from being cold. We had parked about 150 meters away and had a little path we liked to walk down. As we approached, though, I noted some large shoe prints over me and my girlfriend's prints from that morning. That put me even more on edge. I approached further and noticed the prints turned around suddenly and walked back the way they had come. Everything seemed to be in order when we got there, though. We went for a bit of a swim and a bit of a game drive around the farm as well, and returned at around 5:30. I started to make the fire, barbecue the meat, and prepare some other food. Those footprints still had me and my girlfriend on edge, though, and we were both very quiet. We sat down at around 8 p.m. to have dinner together. As we sat down, though, I could tell my girlfriend looked very worried. I asked her what was wrong. She said she had a really bad feeling for some reason, and we had to go right now. I felt the same, honestly. We needed to leave now, not after we ate, right this moment. We checked the food in the cooler, grabbed everything we could, and ran to the car. We jumped in and raced out of there. As we went out the gate and started to drive away, the feeling of dread slowly left us as well. We made the 150-kilometer drive home in the dark and slept in our own beds that night. We woke up on Sunday and went about our day as normal. About 4 p.m. that afternoon, though, my phone number rings. I saw it was the number from the lodge manager. I answered, and he frantically asked if we were okay. I said, yeah, why? He started explaining what happened, and I got ice cold. Apparently, that very same night, the lodge was broken into and ransacked. They took everything of value, and what they couldn't take had been destroyed. It seemed it was a group of men that had done it. Apparently, there was evidence they had ransacked one of the abodes as well. Only one. The one my girlfriend and I had booked into. The one we would have been sleeping in, had we not left so abruptly the previous night. That means they had been watching us the whole time. The lodge had cameras, but the part we were staying in did not. We left just after 8 p.m., probably about 8:20 or so. Cameras caught the first signs of movement at the lodge just before 8:30. At least one was visibly armed with a firearm in the footage, and a few had machetes as well. I shudder to think what would have happened had we actually been there. The nearest people would have been over 3 kilometers away in a straight line, and we were completely alone out there. There wasn't any cell reception at the lodge either. We wouldn't have been able to call for help. Needless to say, we did not go to lodges or isolated areas for a long time after, and sadly, even though we loved that place, it went under not long after too. I saw some ads it was being sold on bank auction. That incident shocked us both a bit, and we vowed to always trust our instincts and intuition from then on, also to tell each other if something ever felt off to one of us. We both had had that uneasy feeling since about 3 that afternoon when we came back, but the reason neither of us said anything was because we didn't want to spoil the trip for the other. The cost was almost the ultimate price. Lesson to be learned here: trust your gut and tell your partner what you're feeling. If something feels off, it's probably because it is. It may just save your life. This story happened when I was a junior in high school. I'm a girl and was a friendly/curious person. 1 month into the fall semester, we got a new transfer student. He looked very nervous. Seated behind me, his name was Joe. I, of course, introduced myself to him, trying to ease some of his tension. I helped to teach him what we'd learned so far, and I helped him look over his class schedule as well. We had 2 classes and lunch period together. Naturally, because of all this interaction, we got to know each other and become somewhat good friends. He was a quiet kid on his own, but he talked quite a lot around me. I assume that just meant he was very comfortable with me. I made it very clear we were just friends, by the way, and he seemed not even interested in anything else. We started hanging out with my group of friends as well. Fast forward to spring break. I told Joe I was going out of town with my family. He seemed very disappointed we couldn't spend the break together, but he said it was understandable. A while later, though, I ran into Joe in a restaurant. I hadn't told him where I was going, so I thought to myself, wow, well, what a coincidence, right? He said he happened to be visiting family in the same town. Going along further in senior year, Joe and I were now hanging out at least once a week. Then that turned into 2, then that turned into 3. I started to notice we were spending a bit too much time together. I wanted to make time for my other friends too, you know? That's when things started to change. I would run into Joe everywhere, or should I say it was more like I'd see him out of the corner of my eye whenever I was spending time with someone else, or hiding behind something when I was by myself. It was obviously very obsessive and clingy. The first 2 or 3 times, I didn't really think that much of it. It all became clear, though, when I questioned him on why this was happening. He told me he was accidentally following me because he wanted to make sure I was safe. Well, now I felt really creeped out. He apologized and asked for forgiveness, but I told him I didn't want to be friends anymore. He got furious and stormed out. He didn't come to school for the next 2 or 3 days. My friends had told me he'd begun harassing them for snitching on him or something. I don't really know how that made sense. He did come back to school eventually, only to pretend he didn't know me. One particular day on my walk home, I began to hear Joe calling my name in a low and unfamiliar tone. When I looked around, though, he was nowhere to be seen. I didn't know why in that moment, but my gut told me I needed to run away as fast as I could. I started sprinting and kept running until I got home. I was too scared to look back. I made sure every door and window was locked up tight. Actually, I hadn't seen him the entire way. I almost convinced myself I was just being paranoid. When my phone screen lit up, Joe was calling me repeatedly. Then I heard him calling my name again. I went to check. He was in front of my house now. He began to bang on the door. I called my dad and told him what happened. I pleaded for Joe to just go away. Everything went completely silent after 5 minutes, which felt like an eternity. The last words I heard from him as he left were, "You'll always be my best friend." The issue was brought up to the school, but Joe never showed up again after. Now 4 years have passed by, and just a few days ago, I got friend requests on 2 of my social media accounts. It was Joe. I blocked him and changed my names to something else. I don't live in the same town, I don't live in the same country. Now I'm on the other side of the world. Still though, I can't help but feel scared like 18-year-old me again. I've become much more cautious around other people because of him. I did report him and get a restraining order against him when that happened. Warning, this story has some graphic details. So I'm just gonna get it out there because it's been heavy on my shoulders for about a month now. The night of National Day here in my country, after having a nice meal with some of my friends, my boyfriend asked me to go check on one of his friends. They had a father-son kind of relationship, and his friend was not feeling very well. He had some heart-related conditions, and my boyfriend was quite worried. On our way home, we decided to stop by his place real quick, around 10 at night. We got there, drank a beer, had a friendly chat with him, his wife, and his stepson for a moment. After about 45 minutes, we were just about to leave when we heard a crazed howling coming from outside in front of the house. In retrospect, it almost sounded like a zombie's growling. His stepson cautiously opened the door and asked what was going on. He didn't even have time to finish his sentence before a man erupted at the door. He was covered in blood. I mean dark black, dried blood. So much of it, I almost thought he was a different ethnicity because his skin had such a dark tone from all that blood. It took me about 30 seconds to realize that all that blood was coming from 2 gigantic, gaping wounds in the side of his head. I must say, he looked and sounded like a living corpse. There were 3 gashes, The biggest was on the middle from his forehead all the way down to the back of his head, 2 inches wide at the largest. The guy began to scream and yell and thrash around before falling to the ground and freezing just like in the movies. We jumped into action. This guy was clearly not in good shape. We brought him out without looking back. I can't really explain what went through my mind in that moment, but I knew that if we were not on our way to the hospital right now, this man would not survive. I sat him down on the front passenger seat and did my best to keep him awake while my boyfriend drove. We called 911 the minute we got onto the road so they could send an ambulance to meet us on the way there. The agent on the phone started asking me to pull the car onto the side of the highway and wait for the ambulance to get there, but we couldn't do that. The man was clearly going to die very soon. We kept on going as fast as possible. We arrived at the hospital before the ambulance and the police. As soon as we got there, medics rushed outside and came to help him right away. The police then arrived too, and took our disposition. Guess what happened next, though? The man had been so badly hurt that he fell into a coma only 30 minutes after arriving, before the police could interrogate him as to what happened. From that moment on, police started procedures for a homicide investigation, and we were considered the prime suspects. They finally let us go home at 4 a.m. They came back the next day asking further questions and letting us know that now they knew we were not related to this crime. They informed us the man had also escaped the hospital the next morning. The attack was probably gang-related, and those gashes had been done by a machete. He'd managed to survive the attack because he was completely strung out on heroin. I'll never forget that night, and that man's horrifying screams. At least I can hold on to the fact that I helped to save a life. I've been wanting to share this for a while, so here goes. In 2007, when I was 12 years old, my family and I took a trip to Key Biscayne, Florida, with some of my cousins and family friends. Naturally, while at the resort, my cousins and I would all hang out at the kids' club. Well, there were always a bunch of kids to hang out with, epic chicken fingers with ranch dressing, and tons of fun games for us all to play. There was a director of the kids' club who watched us and facilitated all of the activities. His name was Dan. In retrospect, I'm sure you can imagine Dan was a major fucking creep. He was around 40 years old, super tall, skinny, and was balding quite badly. The worst part is that he always made us call him Dan the Animal Man. Side note, these sorts of memories leave me in awe of how naive and blinded to danger I was. I'm sure most of us were as a kid, really. If I ever met this guy now, I wouldn't want to get within a 5-foot radius of him. At 12 years old, though, I was thinking he was awesome. Time is a wonderful thing, I suppose. Anyway, I digress. It was made clear to all of us suddenly that Dan, for unknown reasons, was leaving the hotel in a week. None of this fazed me, though. On our last day there, I just so happened to lose my cell phone. It was a bright blue chocolate cell phone, if anyone remembers those gems with the spinning wheel. I quickly told my parents I couldn't find it. Considering this was already the second phone I'd lost that year, my mom yelled at me and told me if I didn't find it, I'd be grounded for a long time. I rushed around the entire hotel, looking everywhere for my phone. Along the way, I just so happened to go into the kids' club to see if anyone there had found it. The room that was typically bustling with kids and activity was now eerily quiet and empty. Dan was just sitting on a couch all by himself. "Hey, Dan, did you by chance see my phone?" I asked him. He responded right away. "Oh, yeah! Actually, I found it and put it in the lost and found in the basement. Come with me, I'll show you." Thinking nothing of this, I mindlessly followed behind Dan as he led me all the way to the back of the hotel. We had walked for around 3 minutes before we arrived at the foot of an abandoned stairwell leading into a dark basement. We were now at the very back of the hotel, in a strange area I'd never seen before, and no one else was in sight. "Are you sure it's down here?" I asked. very confused. I was staring down a long flight of stairs leading into pitch black darkness. The walls were made of unpainted concrete. It didn't even look like it could be a storage area, let alone a basement with a lost and found. Dan nodded happily and held the door open for me, motioning for me to head down myself. Something in that moment suddenly woke up. I'm not sure if it was instinct, fear, or just luck, but I immediately knew I could not go down there. Before Dan could say or do anything, I blurted out, "Never mind, I think I left it with my mom." I darted as fast as I could back to the hotel lobby. I was shaken up. Something about that situation was not right. I just knew he was going to hurt me. As a kid who wore rose-colored glasses and was overly trusting of others, that really shook me. I tried to compose myself and figured I'd investigate a bit more just to be sure. I walked up to the concierge of the hotel and asked them where the lost and found was because I'd lost my phone recently. The woman at the front desk was very nice and told me the lost and found was just right there, right next to her. She then asked me what kind of phone I'd lost. After I told her it was a blue chocolate flip phone, she smiled and pulled it right out of the box under her desk. "Don't worry, someone turned it in here earlier," she said and handed me my phone with a big smile. "Wait, so you're telling me the lost and found isn't in the basement?" I stammered. "No, sweetie, the hotel is still under construction. The basement is being rebuilt. There's not even any electricity down there or anything." That scared the absolute shit out of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that man was dangerous. At the time, I was sharing a hotel room with my cousin, and she was the only person I told. Considering she was only 8 at the time, I think all I did was really freak her out. Now I'm 26 though, and I think back on that moment a lot. I wonder what would have happened to me if I'd gone down to the basement with Dan the Animal Man. It truly feels like one of the most critical junctures of my entire life. I'm happy I knew to get the hell out of there before it was too late. I recently contacted that hotel to inquire about past Kid Club employees named Dan from 2007, just to see if he's still around somewhere, or on a sex offenders list, maybe even in jail. I told them this whole story, but they refused to give me any information about him and sounded pretty sketchy about it, honestly. I'll continue to do some research, and if I ever find more information, I suppose I'll tell you guys as well. Recently, I was shopping in a very popular department store when I had the feeling I needed to use the bathroom. The women's restroom was all the way in the very back of the store, right near an emergency exit. This meant it was pretty secluded. I walked in the 2-stall bathroom. One of them was already taken. Without thinking anything of it, I went into the only other stall available. As soon as I locked the door, though, the person in the other stall, without even flushing, unlocked their door and walked over to the sink. I was not really thinking too much of it in that moment. I'm kind of shy, so I was just sitting there waiting for them to leave. Instead, they did nothing. Now I was kind of confused. I pieced together they were not washing their hands, and they'd never flushed the toilet either. I slowly tilted my head down as quietly as possible to look underneath the stall. I noticed that whoever this was very clearly wearing large men's boots and ratty jeans. Now I was really scared. I'm a natural worrier already, and we were in a very secluded area. I tried to calm myself down and count to 15 to give them a chance to prove me wrong. Maybe it was just a girl fixing her makeup or something. As I was counting, though, I realized that even if it was a woman fixing her hair or something like that, I would surely have heard some sort of shuffling or any noise at all. Instead, it was complete silence. I counted all the way to 15 and still no movement. Now I was fully shaking. I realized just how alone we were. I was cornered in a bathroom with what I assumed was a large man based on their legs. I reached into my purse to fake a phone call. I was so nervous I didn't even think to try to make my phone ring by playing a ringtone first. I just put it to my ear and said, "Hello?" I was too nervous to even keep making up conversation because I didn't know what the man would do. Luckily, as soon as I did this, he left immediately. I watched his feet under the stall to make sure he was gone. Even creepier, I watched him walk to the right. As I exited the bathroom as fast as I could, I noticed that to the right of this restroom was the emergency exit door, now propped open. Who knows what this guy wanted to do, or where he wanted to bring me. There could have been a car right out back waiting for us for all I know. I still can't imagine the face I would have seen looking back at me if I'd just finished my business and left the stall. I told the store manager after. They kinda feigned concern, but I could tell they either didn't really care or didn't believe me. I even called their headquarters the next day to report it again. I went to college in the 70s, so my story is perhaps a little bit older. It's still horribly creepy though. During my freshman year, I decided to drive to my school rather than take a flight. I had an old beater car, you see, and I was positive it would be fine for making the trip though. It would take me a couple of days to drive there. I figured it would be a pleasant little road trip before I started one of the most intimidating moments of my life. Well, it's not until you're driving across country that you realize just how many empty cornfields there are out there. At times, you can just be driving through miles and miles of corn that seems like it will never end. Anyone who's driven through that knows how hypnotic it can get after a while, and it certainly doesn't make it easy driving at night. At one point, very far in the middle of nowhere at night, I suddenly drove by a couple of hitchhikers on the side of the road. I wondered to myself just how they'd gotten so far away from civilization. I didn't pick them up though. I was never comfortable with the idea of picking up strangers. I'd heard too many stories about the unfortunate people that do. Instead, I simply drove right past them. Both guys started yelling obscenities at me for not stopping. I didn't really worry about it though. It wasn't exactly the first time I'd been yelled at, and I'd rather just get yelled at than pick up the wrong people and die by the side of the road or something. I don't know how late it was, but I got really super tired. I still seemed to be in the middle of nowhere, so I decided I would simply pull over and try to get a little bit of shut-eye before continuing. It was a normal thing to do, really. I hadn't even passed by or seen a hotel in quite a long time. I don't know how long I had been asleep when suddenly something woke me up. It was a tiny pinging sound, almost as if a pebble had just hit my car. I looked around. The first thing I noticed was that there was another car just up ahead of me some ways. It seemed someone else had stopped for the night too. It was too far ahead of me to see if anyone was inside or not though. That's when I heard a cracking sound. There was a small crack on my passenger side window. Again, it was as if I'd just been struck by a rock. Of course, I was very surprised. I looked around, but I couldn't see anyone there. Then there was another crack. I looked out into the corn instead. As I concentrated my eyes, I could just barely make out the silhouettes of two people hiding within the corn. It was dark, but it looked like one had a sling or something. When they noticed that I'd seen them, they came out of the corn pretty quickly. They came rushing out at me. I could see it was the two men I had passed by earlier. I had passed them quite a ways back. There's no way they could have caught up with me by just walking. All I could figure was that maybe the person in the car in front of me had given them a ride or something. I wanted to get away right away, so I turned on the ignition. Right then, one of the guys attacked my passenger window and shattered it completely. They both shouted at me, "You remember us, asshole? We're gonna make you pay." Fortunately, the car was able to start, so I just took off while they were trying to break the shattered glass of my window away and climb inside. I drove as fast as I could to get out of there. I was terrified. I thought they would just catch up to me again somehow. Was that car theirs, perhaps? If someone else had picked them up, why didn't I see anyone else there or in the car with them? I kept on looking behind me, waiting to see that car returning in my view. Each time I did, I sped up instinctually. Eventually, I did this when there was a police officer hiding in the dark, and he pulled me over. I got a real fortunate break though. As soon as he pulled me over, those two guys drove right past me, one of them throwing something at my car. The stupidity of this was overwhelming, but I guess they didn't think the cop would bother to go after them, with me already stopped. Fortunately, the cop decided they were the bigger threat. It turns out I was right not to pick those two guys up. Someone did stop for them after me. They robbed him and took his car. That's how they caught up with me. He wasn't killed or seriously injured, thankfully, but still, to have someone rob you and steal from you when you're just trying to be nice and help them is absolutely terrible. In the end, I did still get a ticket, but they went off to jail. When my mom worked at Walmart, she was being harassed by a specific employee. The guy was your typical Billy badass who offered my mom to whoop my brother and I and kick us out when he learned she was widowed. My brothers and I were struggling to find work at the time. This probably would have already been a bad gamble on his end, since my older brother and I worked in the woods frequently and did lots of heavy moving for people. He would often make comments that creeped her out. I told her to report his ass to the boss. One night, my mom let me borrow her truck for something. I dropped her off and told her I was going to pick her up later. We were gonna go to a range day with my friends and teach a friend of mine's fiancé gun safety and how to shoot. I'm a licensed concealed carrier. Even though I am, though, I very rarely carry other than when I'm going hunting or going out to the range. I pulled up to pick my mom up from work. I see the dude she was talking about. He was smoking and seemingly observing us, trying not to make it obvious. My mom handed me money and told me to go grab a few things. I threw my jacket on to cover up my holster and walked in. I noticed he immediately started following me around. He was glaring at me, snarling, as if he was about to pounce and fight me. Every section I went to, he would suddenly appear right behind me. I decided to move throughout a few others and see what he was going to do. While there, I talked to a young female associate, some bullshit boondoggle, just to see his reaction. I could see he was clenching something in his hands and staring angrily. The associate felt uncomfortable as she kept on looking at him behind me. I felt a bit bad for her, so I moved away. He followed me all the way until I cut to the checkout. I got my things and started to leave. As soon as I got back to the car, my mom unlocked the door. Meanwhile, I was burning up. My jacket of choice was quite heavy. I was just unzipping it when my mom looked incredibly worried. I heard footsteps sprinting up to me. I turned around to see the man charging at me. As soon as he saw my holster, though, he stopped in place. "Excuse me, can I help you?" Luckily, I'd forgot to unequip my holster from range day preparations. He zipped over to his rusty truck as quick as possible. He jumped in and waited there, staring at both of us. My mom was, of course, very scared. I could see him light up a cigarette and just sit there watching us. My mom told me to go to the passenger side. I sat down, pulled up my phone, and started to call the police. My mom began driving, and the man immediately cut us off and drove down the road. We could see his truck waiting on the side of the highway. As we drove by, my mom immediately floored it and had me pump gas for her when we arrived at the station. I left my gun in the car with her as she locked the doors. Unbeknownst to my mom, I called her night manager and told her about the aggressive, threatening employee. He was, quote-unquote, shocked. I made it clear that if I saw that employee again, or if he tried to follow me or harass me, I was going to sue that store. It was on management for allowing such dangerous behavior by their own employees, after all. This was seemingly his final straw. Walmart managers had let the sexual harassment slide, but if it was employee-on-customer harassment, now that was too much. I got back in the pickup and my mom drove until we got home. The next morning, I filed a follow-up complaint on this man to the staff. They told me he'd already been fired and banned from the property, and threatened with legal charges as well. My mom came back and seemed a lot happier. She informed me that he had indeed been fired as they'd said, and I was very grateful. Hello. I'm 27 and am married to my husband who's 31. We have 2 children whose fake names are Isaac, who's 8 from my first marriage, and Tiana with my now husband. She's 5 years old. This is sort of an ongoing story, so it doesn't really have a resolution, but I'm very distraught right now. I've been seeing this woman almost everywhere I go. I have no idea if this is happening by coincidence or if she's doing this on purpose or what, and I'm trying my best to calmly remember it all. The whole situation started somewhere around May 2022. Isaac and I were at the local park, just playing together and doing our own thing. My son went off to play with some other child at the monkey bars when I saw this random woman approach me. She had red hair, which I'm pretty sure was natural, and her face seemed to be incredibly tear-stained. I became concerned. I thought she had been crying. I proceeded to ask her what was wrong, if she was all right, if there was anything I could do to help her. Instead of answering, though, she turned and stared at my son. The more she looked at him, the more she began to sob. All of a sudden, she sprinted right at him and picked him up, screaming, "Michael!" She kept calling him that. It really freaked me out. I mean, he was this random person, running to my kid, picking him up, and calling him a different name. My son and the other child got scared as well. I approached them quickly. I screamed at her to get lost, but she just stood there as I grabbed my son back. She seemed to get pretty enraged, actually. She muttered something I couldn't hear as she stomped away out of sight. The other child's father and I talked for a bit. He seemed quite alarmed by what had happened as well. He told me, though, that maybe she was a grieving mother, and my son just looked like the child she'd lost or something. Still, I was very disturbed. I took my son home soon after. Since then, I'd been afraid to take any of my children to public areas, despite my husband's reassurance. Eventually, things started to settle down a bit, but skip to June 2nd, 2022. I suddenly got a call from my school stating that a woman who was a new volunteer for lunch duty had kept mentioning that my son was her Mikey Bear and that she'd been searching for him for years. They told me another worker who had been volunteering with them had reported her for this strange behavior. Of course, I was scared as hell. I acted immediately by signing my kids out for the day. When I called the school the next day, I was informed she was no longer there. I became pretty freaked out. I had no idea what this woman was going to do now. Skip to last week, July 13th, 2022. It was Tiana's birthday. We decided to host it at a park in my in-laws' hometown, somewhere far away. Everything went well, although I was a bit paranoid. It was then somewhere around 9 p.m. when we'd just begun tidying up. As I took a glance at some oak trees in the distance, admiring the view, I could have sworn I had seen her hiding behind one of them. I screamed at the top of my lungs and started to chase after her, but she sprinted away and disappeared. Ever since then, I've not seen her, but I really feel like this is not the end of it. I'm seriously considering homeschooling my children because of all that's happened. This happened 15 years ago now, when I had just come home from college on winter break. Home this time was not the house I'd grown up in. My parents had recently moved closer to our small city. It just didn't feel the same. It was a different space. Maybe that's what triggered my worry. In my family, I'm always the one thinking of worst-case scenarios. I'm generally distrustful and mostly seem like an annoying worrywart sometimes. Call it what you will, but it's also a gift of fear, am I right? One cold night, my parents had gone to bed upstairs, and the dog had followed suit. I thought I'd watch a bit of TV in the living room myself for a bit before going to sleep. I settled in on the couch. The living room was in front of the house, and with the recent move, the shutters on the windows weren't there at the moment, only see-through curtains that weren't really drawn even. I noted this, but I was used to our rural setting, when the only ones who could see in anyway were the neighbors we'd known for like 20 years. I was watching TV for about a half hour, when suddenly the screen just kinda cut out. It went all snowy, with the static and stuff. This was back in the days when you only watched whatever your local cable channels brought you. I looked up from whatever I was doing, maybe texting with a flip phone or something. At first, I was simply thinking, well, that sucks, but something felt off to me. I tried the remote, but no other channels worked either. I was sitting there thinking what I should do instead, when my cat jumped onto the windowsill and started wailing. What the fuck? This may seem innocuous, but anyone who knew my cat knew this was very strange behavior. He was pacing back and forth, wailing and staring out the window. A feeling of dread washed through me, and I was frozen. That feeling of dread was so fiercely visceral. What the hell was going on? Something was out there. I tried to settle myself down in this unfamiliar dark house. I did feel a bit better because what were the chances someone was out there? But then, there it was. I swear on all I have, this cold waft of air blew through, and I heard the side door open. I didn't even realize that door was there at the time. I became frozen. I sprinted upstairs to wake my parents and slumbering dog, frantically telling them someone else was inside the house now. I think they were annoyed. They thought I was just being a worrier like normal. Still, they did get up and I think try to placate me by looking around the house. They went to check all the rooms, including the basement, while I was simply scared and exasperated. They were sleepily roaming around into dark rooms completely unarmed, when God knows who had made it inside already. To my surprise, they didn't find anything though. They verbally patted me on the head and said goodnight, and I felt really foolish. That is, until the very next morning. I don't know what prompted my parents to call the police, but they did. They showed up very quickly and asked me how I'd known someone was out there. Wait, hold up, what? I started answering. Well, the cat was meowing a lot on the windowsill, you see, and my voice trailed off, waiting for the mocking reaction I'd usually get. Which I did get somewhat. The cop smirked. A cat, huh? Alright, well, get on with it then. He went on to say that someone cut the cable wires on the side of the house. They thought that whoever that person was had thought they were disarming the alarm or something. When they saw me sitting there watching TV, maybe they decided to leave. And the side door, the muddy ground gave us the ability to see the fresh tracks leading right up to it. It didn't look like it had been fooled with, but I know what I heard. However, they were able to get in. I knew it, I said to my parents. That triumphant feeling was short-lived, though, when I started to mull over what I'd just seen was true. I did know someone was out there, but I didn't really do anything. And if that person had enough ill intention, they could have easily done something bad to me and then my parents. From then on, I would always check that side door and make sure it was firmly secure, and I'd always listen to the cues from my cat as well, just to be safe. So, the story. I grew up in La Crosse, Wisconsin, a semi-small city with a very low crime rate. At least, it was back in the day when I was 14 years old. It was such a nice, quiet city that almost nobody locked their doors. I'm sure you're familiar with the type of place. People would say hi to each other on the street, and you could pretty much go to anyone's house for dinner. Your parents wouldn't be too nervous about you staying out at night or anything like that. You could walk home by yourself from your middle school basketball game or whatever without any fear, which is what I was doing this particular night. It had been a very long game and got on much later than usual. My parents had to both work in the morning, so they hadn't gone with me. That was fine though, since they went to all my other games. Couldn't be helped if they missed one every now and then. They needed to get up early tomorrow anyway. It was only an 8-minute walk from my middle school to my home, so I didn't really have any concerns about my safety. So there I am walking, right? I'm wearing a pink sweater and jeans over my basketball jersey. My hair was a sweaty mess, but I was in a really good mood. It had been a very exciting and fun game. I was walking in a very relaxed fashion, not really paying attention to my surroundings. And then I suddenly felt it. I can't explain how I knew, but I just knew in that moment. I was suddenly in some sort of danger. I looked all around me, only to see parked near the blacktop fence was a Jeep idling with its lights off. I couldn't see who was inside because of this, but I knew someone was for some reason. I ducked my head and walked away from it, hoping I hadn't caught their attention. No such luck, though. The Jeep began to follow me. It pulled up right next to me. I saw the window begin to open, and I fucking booked it. I didn't look back once. I just ran. I'd had such a negative feeling about that car. I didn't stop until I could see my parents' house. I thought I was safe as I arrived there. Just as I stopped in front of the door to catch my breath, I heard an engine rev behind me. That same Jeep was tearing down the street, beelining towards me. I was in a position where I couldn't run anywhere safe in time. I just stood there frozen in terror, thinking this guy was going to run me over into my own house. I backed up against the door. I must have looked every bit the victim, with my sweaty hair and pale face. The Jeep simply pulled up near me. The door began to open, but some old guy across the street ran out of his house and began to yell and throw things at the car. I don't even know what the guy had said. The Jeep's door immediately slammed shut though, and it peeled away in a hurry. I didn't even get to thank the guy who had helped me, which I did feel bad about. He might have just saved me from something horrible. I simply ran into my home though. I threw myself inside and slammed the door behind me, scaring the shit out of my mom, who happened to be right there just heading to bed. When she asked me what was wrong, I told her everything, and she woke up my dad. We considered calling the police, but I didn't really have any description to give them. I hadn't seen the person inside, and I hadn't seen their license plate either. All I knew was that it was a dark Jeep and it had chased me. Not very much information to go on. After that night, my parents never let me walk home from school again. A week later, there was a story in the paper. There had been a gang rape of a young woman at a nearby parking garage, only 5 minutes away from my house. That very same Jeep seemed to be the perpetrator. I was 14 when this occurred, and I'm 22 now. I still remember it in crisp detail though, and it freaks me out to this day, thinking what might have happened if things had turned out just a bit differently. School was out for the summer, and I had convinced my mom to send me to Russia for a couple of months to visit my grandparents. We'd moved to North America when I was little, and I hadn't ever been back much since. Plus, I thought it would be fun being on my first trip abroad all by myself. She agreed, and off I went on my first solo transatlantic journey. My grandparents are very great people, and have always spoiled my mother and I rotten. They were ecstatic their only granddaughter wanted to visit them, so they planned a fun vacation of their own with me for a month after I arrived, to a popular beach resort city in Turkey. We were to stay at a 5-star resort in Ankara for 2 weeks. I thought that was spectacular, getting to travel to not just one but 2 countries in a single summer, and to a fancy exotic place like Turkey at that. I was dying to go. Full disclosure though, when I arrived to Russia, it was not really what I had been expecting. My grandparents are really protective people, so I couldn't do much or go anywhere by myself. That meant it got boring pretty fast, and I spent most of my days just playing PSP in my room. I was very accustomed to being active, you see, and I wanted to do lots of things like go jogging, which I'd done every day at home. I gave my grandparents a bit of a hard time about that, since they wouldn't let me go alone, and naturally they couldn't keep up with me due to their age. After about a month of this, the time came to go to Turkey together. I was super excited to finally get some freedom and a change of scenery. I had been pent up at home for far too long. The resort they had picked was sprawled out over a fairly large area. However, it was all very well secured and isolated from the rest of the city. There was also a huge garden on the property as well, which was very well suited for jogging. This time, I also had my own room separate from my grandparents too, so I took the opportunity to go off by myself and explore the grounds a bit. Most of the time, I would jog in the mornings when it was a bit cooler. I would go with my big old iPod, so I couldn't hear anything that was going on around me. I figured it was really safe since it was a really nice hotel with lots of tourists around as well. Then I started to notice him, a pretty innocuous-seeming gardener in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing this dark green uniform. I remember he kind of reminded me of like a shriveled old date from too many years in the sun. He would always wave or say something in broken English as I passed by, while he trimmed the shrubs or mowed the lawn. I would politely wave back, smile, and nod, but didn't really pay him much attention. Fast forward to about 10 days of this, and now I was really enjoying myself. It was fun to swim in the pool and the sea, the food was really great. And my grandparents had eased up a lot so I could do a lot more by myself. They didn't know about my morning runs in the gardens though, and I was not going to tell them because I was sure they would not approve. One morning, around 7 a.m. while I'm jogging, I see that gardener again. This time though, it's clear he's trying to get my attention specifically. He waves at me and yells something, so I stop and pull out my earphones, trying to figure out what he wants. Now, I know he works for the hotel, so I didn't really suspect anything. He waved at me again and motioned for me to come a bit closer. I was very confused, but I figured he wanted to tell me something, so I politely approached him. He was standing at the edge of a trail that went deeper into the gardens and off into the foliage. He was smiling and gesturing, and I could see he was holding something in his hand. I noticed he was holding a rose and extending it to me. At this point, I was confused and a little bit freaked out about what the hell he was thinking. I stayed put. Usually, the hotel staff there were chatty but nice enough. My grandparents would always get pulled into various conversations with them about things. I figured this was something of the same like. I didn't want to be rude, but I still wanted to be on my way without offending this old man. He handed me the flower and I took it, thinking maybe he wanted to show me some roses that were in bloom or something. He kept waving and gesturing like he wanted me to follow him, and stupidly I walked a bit closer. He had another flower in his hand and backed away more. Then, suddenly he stopped and started to lower it a little. That's when I noticed he was holding his other hand behind his back, and he was clearly holding something. I looked up ahead to the trail to see this little hidden-away cabin type thing where I assumed they kept their gardening supplies. Something clicked in my head then, and I began to slowly back away. The man saw me do that and tried to smile, then moved the hand he'd been holding behind his back while lunging toward me. I saw he was clearly holding some kind of rag. Without hesitation, I dropped the rose he had handed me, turned around, and sprinted at full speed. I didn't even stop to look back. I just ran like mad back to the hotel. It was not until the doors closed behind me, and I was among other people, that I looked back to see if the man had followed me. I couldn't see him anymore, though. My heart was beating like crazy. I went back to my hotel room and waited for my grandparents to wake up. I never told them about any of what happened that day, and spent the rest of my vacation glued to their side. I thought if I'd said anything, they would get even more paranoid about my safety and blame me for wandering off on my own. Also, I really loved them and I kinda didn't want to ruin the remaining days for them. I saw the gardener once more on the beach. I remember seeing him talking to a security guard. I grew very uncomfortable and sunk into my sun chair as I saw him. He looked over to me and smiled. I scowled at him as he mouthed the word Rosa tauntingly and smiled again. I still remember the anger bubbling in my stomach and how much I wanted to cleave his face in. I just froze there and stared though. He walked away, and I went back to pretending nothing ever happened. Needless to say, I never went on any more morning jogs, and neither did I want to until long after that summer had ended, and I'd returned back home. Okay, so years of watching and reading about true crime has led me to be extra cautious and always on the lookout for people who are out of place or acting odd. I believe this has helped me from several bad encounters, and this is probably the worst of them. I was a junior in college at a local university that was located in the city. The campus was about a mile wide, and I lived just over a mile away from it. I lived in an apartment building that was owned by the university, so only students lived there. It was known as the poor kids' apartments and was the farthest from campus. It was also in a fairly bad part of town. The apartments had recently had issues with break-ins, so I was extra cautious about who I held the door open for. The door to the elevators was one that locked when it closed, and only people who lived there had the keys. Sometimes, though, people held the door to save you needing to grab your key. It was about 6 p.m. one night, and I was just returning home from class. I had planned on just stopping at my apartment and then leaving to drive to my mom's house for the weekend. I worked about 40 minutes away near my mom's home, so I tended to stay there on weekends anyway. As I was approaching the elevator door, I noticed that someone was holding it open for a group of us. As I was walking towards it, I noticed one of the people he'd held it open for did not appear to be a college student. Not only was he much older, in his early 40s or so, but he looked homeless, for lack of better words. He was extremely dirty and was wearing dirty clothes as well. Obviously, he stood out to me, but apparently not to the other people in the elevator, because no one was really watching him except for me. I watched to see what floor he would push when he walked in, but he didn't push a floor button at all. Big red flag right away. I was on the very top floor, and I was one of the last people to enter. I noticed I was the only one to push that floor button. Fuck, if this guy didn't get out on the lower floor, he was definitely up to something. As the floors started to open and people started to get out, I noticed he was now looking right at me, not getting off at any of the other stops. Before long, it was just me and him. I had to think fast because the fact he didn't press my floor but had entered before me, and the fact that he appeared out of place, were both huge red flags. I decided I would let him out of the elevator first. Then he would have the choice of left or right. If he chose left, I could run right and get to my door. I got my key ready and let him out. He hesitated for a moment, and I pretended to be stuck looking for something in my purse. He got out and went left. Awesome. I head right and sprint right into my apartment, which was located fairly close to the elevator. I glance back just as I'm walking in and see him standing in front of a random door, looking at me. I went into my room and locked the door right away. I grabbed the few things I needed and kept thinking about how weird that was. I almost started to let myself think that maybe he was dating someone in one of the other apartments. I started to try and rationalize his behavior, but I knew this was just strange. I grabbed my things and headed back out. I made sure to double-check the hallway before going to the elevator as well. It was empty. Thank God. I get back in the elevator and take it down to the lobby. I go to get out, when who do I see getting in with a brand new group of people? That same guy. What the fuck? Now I knew for sure he was not supposed to be here. He saw me, and his eyes grew wide immediately. I went to pull out my phone because I knew I couldn't just let him wander around here. I was about to call the cops while walking out of the lobby when I ran into the security guard who watches our building after a certain time. I told him everything I'd seen. He decided to contact the police and have them waiting for the man when he got back down. He said he would go up and try to find him as well. He told me I did the right thing. I still felt bad that someone else could have potentially been in danger. I hoped he was only a thief and not some sort of rapist or murderer. I didn't hear anything else about it after, and never ran into that same security guard again, so I can't say what happened for sure. I'd luckily caught a good look at him, so I hope my description helped find him at least. He might have known I was going to do something though, and aborted his mission before he got caught. Either way, I always tell people to watch out for stuff like that. Stuff that we always call red flags around here. A few years back, my husband and I were living in an apartment in Brooklyn. One night, we decided to check our neighborhood's sex offender registry and discovered an offender lived in our building. It wasn't really a big deal to us, as we didn't have any children at the time, but I should mention that this guy was one creepy-looking dude. I'm talking about those wild hair, crazy eyes kind of creeper. You know, the real scary kind. We would often see the guy walking around the building or the neighborhood every now and then. He even set up a fruit stand for a while and would wildly yell at people as they passed by. He never really bothered us though, so we mostly didn't give him a second thought. At the time, I was working a pretty crazy job where I would be at work really late every night and have to take a taxi home at the end. On those nights, my husband would stay up late and wait for me to arrive home. I was a bit brain dead when I would get home after a 20-hour shift, so sometimes it would take me a while to find my keys, and my husband would have to let me in. One night, I had texted I was leaving the office around 3 a.m. About half an hour later, my husband could hear our door handle jiggling. Assuming it was me, he got up to go let me in. Something, however, made him look out the peephole first. There he saw him, the sex offender, completely naked, standing on the other side of the door. As soon as he sensed my husband looking out, the man stopped jiggling the handle. He looked up and put his eyeball right up to the peephole, trying to gaze in, as if he could tell my husband was looking at him right now. For some reason I don't really understand, my husband opened the door. As soon as he did this, the guy tried to force himself into the apartment. Eventually he beat the man back and got the door closed. Then he called me. I was about a mile away from our building when I got that call, and I was terrified. It must have been quite obvious, because as we arrived to the building, the taxi driver asked if he should walk me to the front door. I told him yes, I would very much appreciate that. He stood with me until my husband came outside to walk me in. We lived on the 6th floor, and from the moment we went in, you could hear someone running up and down the staircase. We ran to the elevator and jumped in, pressing the door close button over and over until it started to move. When we got to about the 3rd floor, the floor where the sex offender was at the time, he began to bang on the elevator doors trying to get in. We heard him run to the staircase and start running up the stairs to catch us. When we got to our apartment, I called the cops to report this terrifying situation. It took them 2 hours just to arrive, and by that time the guy had already picked up his clothes and gone home. The cops didn't even come inside the building. They made us go outside and didn't even get out of their car. When I explained what happened, they simply responded by saying, "You live in Brooklyn, get used to it." Eventually, we moved out of that building, but whenever we go back to that neighborhood, we still see that guy at his fruit stand, yelling at people as they walk by. So this story didn't happen to me. It actually happened to my very good friend who we'll call Dan. Dan is a 5'10" man from Maryland. He had a very strange sense of humor and was a very smart but all-around good guy. Anyway, we went to the same university. I'm gonna tell this story as best as I can remember, so please bear with me. Dan moved into his dorm room before his roommate did our freshman year. Dan had everything all moved in and had settled in completely. Just as he sat down, his roommate showed up to move everything in. His roommate, we'll call him Brian, introduced himself and his mother and father, who were helping him move. He seemed just like any other person. Dan decided to help his new roommate move everything in, since he didn't know anyone yet and was from a different state. Dan and Brian's family get down to their car, as Brian stayed behind in the room to put things away. This is the first red flag in this story. As they were opening the trunk, Brian's father looked at Dan directly in the face and whispered, "Good luck." Dan thought he meant with classes. He said thanks and grabbed a box, but boy was he wrong. Dan carried that box upstairs and into the room, where Brian proceeded to flip out. He screamed about how that box had his special ingredients for a project he was doing, and Dan had probably broken it. Weird, but everyone has their quirks. They finished moving Brian in and his parents said goodbye, and again, Brian's dad told Dan good luck. It was really weird. Anyway, a couple of guys came by the door to ask if they wanted to go eat. Dan said sure, but Brian stayed behind to finish unpacking his things. While Dan was out, he got a call from Brian, asking if he would mind if he smoked weed in the room. Dan, being that he wanted to work for the CDC, said absolutely not. Brian screamed something unintelligible and hung up the phone. He called back a few minutes later and asked if he could smoke weed in the closet at least. Again, Dan said no. Brian hung up without a word, and Dan and his friends decided to go make sure he wasn't actually smoking in the room. When they arrived, they found him hiding in the closet like a goblin eating the weed. Weird as hell, right? Not even close to as bad as this will get, though. As time continued on, at night, Brian would wake Dan up by standing beside his bed, standing over him, then asking him a single question. Dan would answer, and Brian would walk back to his bed and fall asleep. This happened every night for a week. At this point, Brian had moved in an entire toolbox full of wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, nails, screws, an assortment of power tools as well. These weren't the kinds of things you'd need with you in a college dorm room. During this entire week, Brian also never left the room. The only time he would move was to eat and go to the bathroom. About 4 days before the week where dorm room changes could be made, Brian woke Dan up in the middle of the night and asked him how he felt about gay people. Dan said he didn't really care what anyone did, and it was fine with him. When Dan woke up the next morning, Brian was sitting in a chair directly by his head, staring at his sleeping face. Of course, he instinctively yelled out, "What the fuck are you doing?" Brian replied, "I think I'm starting to have feelings for you. You need to move out. I don't want you getting hurt during what's coming." After that, Dan left and didn't sleep in his room for a couple of days until he could move. Unfortunately, though, there were no open rooms, so he couldn't. During this time, Brian started to follow Dan around. He would sleep in the closet with his tools, making something. Dan eventually convinced the head of the dorm to let him move into the now empty room next door, after 3 weeks in what he described as pure hell. Dan moved to the room next door, so no big deal, right? Wrong. 2 days later, Dan got a knock at the door at 9 a.m. Thinking it was Brian coming to fuck with him, he screamed out, "What the fuck do you want?" He answered the door in his boxers. At the door, though, there were 4 state police troopers in full hazmat gear. The man in front said, "Not who you were expecting, huh?" At least someone there had a sense of humor. They let Dan put some clothes on, then led him out the door. At the end of the hallway was Brian in handcuffs. Turns out Brian had been building pipe bombs and other sorts of explosives in the dorm room while Dan was away at class. After Dan had moved out, he took over the other bed and the closet for his bomb-making activities. The reason the hazmat team was there was because Brian had spilled liquid mercury all over the floor, and they were afraid it had seeped into the other rooms. When they went through all of Brian's things, they found a plan that also had guns hidden around the city. This kid had planned a massive attack. On a special note, though, he had written Dan's name down with a heart drawn around it, and wrote specifically, "Do not kill." Brian is obviously in prison now. I think I was about 18 years old when I first joined the online dating community. One of my friends had convinced me to sign up since I had just gone through a terrible breakup. I was still technically in high school, but only about 2 months from graduation. As I was clicking through one of the dating sites on my phone, I came across someone who seemed decent looking enough, and fairly normal based on what I could tell from his profile. It said he was the son of a local cop, whose name I'll leave out because he's well known around these parts. We'll call him Officer V. We'll call his son Ren. Ren had just moved in with his dad from Florida and was looking to meet some new people. We chatted online for a while, then decided to meet up and go for a walk. We met up at a local ice cream shop and then walked around the downtown area getting to know each other a bit. Now, right off the bat meeting him, I was not super into him. I know nerves can get the best of people though, so I decided to give him another chance. I was a member of the marching band in high school, and we always did the local parades for Memorial Day and such like that. Well, Ren and I had been texting all day talking about meeting up for a picnic or some such after I was done with those parades. When I told Ren we were just finishing up and I needed to get home and get clean before we went out, that's when things took a turn for the creepy. He insisted on picking me up from the end of the parade, and after 10 minutes of arguing, I finally convinced him that no, he would not pick me up, and would in fact wait for me to change and get cleaned up first. After I was done getting changed, I gave him my address and said he could come pick me up if he'd like. Not even 3 minutes later, he was already waiting outside. When I hopped into his car, I smelled something awful, something that can only be described as rotting and dead. I'm a messy person, sure, but I've never let my car get that gross on the inside, much less letting a date see it in that state. There were food wrappers everywhere, dirty laundry. It looked as though this guy had been living out of this car. When I asked him what we would be doing for the evening, he said we were going out to dinner, but he wanted to show me something first. You see, we lived near the third largest national military cemetery in the US, and that's where this guy took me. I would have understood, being as it was Memorial Day, wanting to make a quick stop and pay respects to those who had served. But there was no paying respect being done here. We drove through the cemetery, and he pointed out every single grave he was even remotely related to. To make matters worse, we drove through 4 cemeteries. 4 of them. When we left the last one, I thought we could finally get on with the day. Boy, was I wrong. We went back to his house, and I asked if we were still going to dinner. Well, yeah, but we have to wait for my dad, Officer V. He's taking us there. I was a good kid and never got into too much trouble, but the thought of being stuck in a restaurant with a cop watching me was more than a little unnerving. Why hadn't the guy told me this in the first place? As we were sitting on the couch watching TV, waiting for Officer V to come home, R decided it was a good time to try to make a move on me. He leaned in to kiss me and attempted to say something cute before doing so. I immediately turned my face away because of the awful stench emitting from this guy's mouth. I've dated smokers before and cigarette breath didn't really bother me, but this scent was indescribable. It was like cigarette breath on steroids. That's the only way I can say this. Thankfully, moments later, his father walked in and announced he was ready to go. After a few brief questions about my age and making sure it was okay for him to take me across state lines, we left for dinner. The entire meal, R didn't say a single word. Instead, his father basically interrogated me. Thankfully, that dinner was short. After the meal, I texted one of my friends to tell her I needed a way out of this situation. I told her to call me and pretend to be upset. As it turned out, Officer V was dating her mother, unbeknownst to me. So Ren already knew who she was quite well, in fact. I told Ren I needed to go because my friend was really upset and needed my help. Well, he downright refused to take me back to my car so I could go home, even though the only way to get to her house was to drive directly past mine where my car was parked. After that, an argument ensued about him not taking me home. He dropped me off at her house instead, and I immediately jumped out of the car without saying goodbye or thank you. At this point, I was sure Ren must have gotten the hint I was most certainly not interested. I thought I would be in the clear. His tours of the cemeteries and refusal to take me back to my car so I could go home were huge red flags. I knew this was not someone I wanted to be dating, let alone have him in my life. I blocked him on the site and deleted his number as well. The following weeks got progressively creepier though. He would somehow call and text my number all the time, even though he knew I would not answer. He would come to the baseball games I worked at and just stand there watching me. A few times I even had to have the coach throw him out because he was bothering the team. He called me once and I had my friend screen the call and blatantly tell him I was not interested and to stop doing this. He still didn't get the hint. The calls and texts continued for weeks and weeks, and I would even notice him driving by my house at all times of the day sometimes. I only ever ran into him in person once after that, at a local bar and pizza shop. I was at the bar with some friends when I noticed him walk in. As he came up behind me to talk to me, I turned my head and clearly ignored him and acted like I had neither seen or heard him. He stood there for a few minutes in silence behind me, waiting. Then he just walked away, and I've not seen or heard from him since. My friend often tells me how creepy he still is, as her mother and Officer V are now married. Word is, Ren recently got married as well. I feel so bad for that poor girl. I just hope he isn't such a creep to her like he was to me.